Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, I am joined by journalist, novelist, and writing coach John Dedakis. John has had a 45-year journalism career, and he also had a stint as a White House correspondent. So we're going to be talking to him about his writing, coaching, and his career. So, John, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Curtis. It's good to be here.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, let's see. From La Crosse, Wisconsin, along the Mississippi River. Grew up there, did a stint in the Army for about 3.5 years during the Vietnam War era. I wasn't in Vietnam, but it was that time in the country's life. Went into journalism, was a journalist for 45 years, covered Reagan during the last 3 years of his presidency, went to CNN in 1988 as a writer, became an editor, and during that time, I started writing fiction. And over the last 20 years, I've got 6 mystery suspense thriller novels in print. And I also became a manuscript editor, a writing coach, a writing teacher. And I basically am also a motivational speaker, helping people use writing as a way to heal from grief.
Yeah, we'll kind of talk about, I guess, as much as you can about your stint as a White House correspondent. Kind of tell us how that was and what you did, if you can.
Well, I worked for the Christian Broadcasting Network. Pat Robertson was the founder of that. And for 2 years, I was a general assignment reporter at the network based in Virginia Beach. And then I became their White House correspondent in 1985. And so between 85 and 88, that's where I was. It also happened to correspond with the candidacy of my boss, Pat Robertson, when he ran for president in 1988. And so that was kind of tricky trying to play it straight as a reporter while there was a lot of pressure on me to get on board the Robertson for President campaign train, which I didn't do. But we played it straight, and it was a good experience. It was well, it's sort of the holy of holies of politics back there in Washington and at the White House. So it was a very instructive time, and I think the one takeaway that has sustained me going forward is that the relationship between the press and the president is by definition, an adversarial relationship. It's the press secretary's job to make the president and his policies look perfect. It's the job of reporters to find out what's really going on. And so, no matter who's president, no matter what party they're in, there are a lot of times when they're not happy with their press coverage.
Well, for 7 years, you were editor for Wolf Blitzer. So talk about how you feel like journalism has evolved since that time and any concerns you might have, and tell the listeners what Wolf was like
Oh,
working for.
excellent. Oh, well, I mean, that was an honor to work with him. I mean, Wolf, as far as I'm concerned, is a journalist's journalist. He cares more than anything about accuracy. I worked with him for 7 years, and I don't know what his politics are because his job was to inform, not persuade. Now, there are some people who may disagree with me. That's fine. They're entitled to their opinion. But I was up close and I saw him every day play it straight. And so working with Wolf was a great experience. That said, journalism has evolved. It's evolved over the last 100 years or more, and it's often driven by technological advances. The typewriter, the telephone, all of these things have helped speed things up. And we're now at a point where we have the internet, we have live television, and so basically anyone with a telephone is a publisher if they hit post or send. But in most cases, there's not an editor on those people's shoulders asking them, where did you get that? How do you know it's true? And yet, a lot of these influencers have hundreds of thousands and even millions of followers. So, journalism has changed a lot because it's the Wild West out there, and it requires a tremendous amount of diligence and discernment on the part of the news consumer to get information that is reliable as opposed to just reinforcing their political opinions.
Let's talk about how you got into journalism and talk about um, what was it easy to switch from a journalism to being a novelist?
That's really two questions. The first part of the question is getting into journalism in the first place. My plan was to go into law with my dad. My dad was a lawyer, and the plan was that I was going to go into practice with him and then use law as a stepping stone to get into politics. And so my plan was to become president. I'd start with alderman, then mayor, and then governor, and so on. For the good of the country, I decided to go in a different direction, primarily because I was a student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the late 60s and early 70s when the Vietnam War was a big deal. It was in all the papers. And they had a draft, which meant that if you had a number below 150, you were going to Vietnam. You may have a student deferment for a while, but that was only temporary. My number was 14, so it didn't look real good. I decided to enlist to avoid the draft because I couldn't, in good conscience, either go to jail or Canada for my beliefs because I wasn't against all war. If, when we were fighting Nazi Germany and Japan, during World War II, that seemed to be a war I would be able to support, even though I'd certainly be worried about my well-being if I'd, gotten drafted. So, I enlisted, and they had something called military journalism. And so I went to my first formal journalism training was in the Army. I did get orders to Vietnam, but they were changed at the last minute to Germany. And I spent 2.5 years at the headquarters of the American Forces Radio and Television Network in Frankfurt, Germany, doing interviews for a special events radio unit. And the first interview I did was with Alfred Hitchcock, this legendary film director. I mean, maybe you've heard of him. And that was what sealed the deal. I found what I was good at and what I loved. And so when you put those two things together, you've got purpose and propulsion in your life. So when I got out of the Army, I went back to journalism school at the University of Wisconsin, and the rest is history. I stayed in journalism for 45 years. Now,
And just so you know,
the other part of your question was making the transition from journalist to novelist. That was tricky because while I was at CNN, they made me an editor. And that paid well, but it was tedious. It was fault finding, and I needed a creative outlet. And so I began to start playing with writing fiction, which was it was difficult for any number of reasons. One is that it was hard to give myself permission to make things up because at a reputable news organization, unlike what some presidents will tell you, it is a firing offense to make things up. But I finally figured out that I could make things up in my characters and create stories that were separate from, covering the news on a day-to-day basis. So it took about 10 years for me to get the agent that I've got and get the publishing deal that I had. And so it took a while to learn the craft and learn the business.
Let's take a quick break.
Okay, everybody, it's Michael E. Cullen II.
And I'm Sesame and Carta from the All Too Real 2 podcast. We're passionate about movies, TV, and pretty much all things pop culture.
Dive into the chaos of failed sitcoms, direct-to-video sequels, and the quirky realms of cinema and TV.
Join us every Thursday for your dose of All Too Real 2 entertainment.
We'll guide you through debates like whether Howard the Duck qualifies as a superhero.
Ponder if Larry the Cable Guy could be the new Rock or Schwarzenegger.
Discover if some shows and movies movies should have stayed in the cutting room.
Ever heard of a sitcom featuring that dictator with the funny mustache? Well, we watched it.
We're dedicated to unraveling the peculiarities of pop culture, sometimes with awesome guests.
So, if you're into the eccentric world of pop culture,
listen and subscribe to All Too Real 2.
Available wherever you find podcasts
and on Age of Radio.
Well, just so you know, jokingly, I have absolutely no idea who Alfred Hitchcock is.
My goodness. Well, Alfred Hitchcock was especially big in the 1950s and 60s. His films are legendary. Psycho, North by Northwest, Rear Window. He was considered to be the master of suspense.
Yep, and he used to give me a lot of nightmares at night. So let's talk about social media and artificial intelligence. Do you feel like they are a blessing or a curse? Kind of go through that with the listeners. Blessing or a curse.
Well, they're artificial intelligence and the internet, and social media, they are morally neutral. The problem is when you get people involved. And I mentioned the problem with people spreading falsehoods on the internet. And artificial intelligence is also here to stay, but it has strengths and weaknesses. Some of the strengths are that it can really provide you with a lot of information. You can use it as a resource tool so long as you check the sources that it provides you. It can be a great source in being able to take something that's very complex and synthesizing it down to a summary in any number of ways of writing succinctly. There are several problems with artificial intelligence, though. At least when it comes to writing, I don't recommend it as a writing tool because artificial intelligence doesn't know you as intimately as you know you. And that is where your creativity resides, in your personal experiences and your subconscious. Artificial intelligence can't access that. Consequently, the stories that it writes are bland and flat, and they don't have the emotional punch that you can bring to a story on your own. Artificial intelligence is definitely a problem when it's used as, let's say, a therapist. There are incidents where artificial intelligence has actually talked people into killing themselves. So there are some very serious problems with artificial intelligence. It is now able to create what they call deep fakes. In other words, using video that looks very authentic, making a politician say things that they never said or do things that they never did. And it requires a tremendous amount of discernment for us to be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's fake. And then there's one other problem I see with artificial intelligence, and that is the tremendous amount of electricity that it takes to produce it. There are data farms that require just it's just a drain on the electrical grid, and that of course has ramifications for the environment. Now, will there be advances technologically that will make it much more efficient for artificial intelligence to operate? Perhaps, but right now there are some strengths, but I think that there are some big dangers that we need to be aware of.
Can you tell us about your books? Kind of tell us about all of your books, what we can expect when we read them, and where we can go get them.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate the question. I've written 6 mystery suspense thriller novels. They're a series, but you don't have to read them in order, but I'll take you through them quickly. My protagonist, Lark Chadwick, is a 20-something young woman. You'll notice I'm neither of those things. And the book starts in southern Wisconsin. She's a college dropout, the victim of sexual assault, and she's a little wobbly with her life right at that point and vexed about what she's going to do going forward. She writes what she thinks is the best, the great American novel. It keeps getting rejected. And when she goes home to talk with her aunt who raised her from infancy to kind of consult about what can I do to get better, she finds the body of her aunt on the floor, the victim of carbon monoxide poisoning, an apparent suicide, which is very closely aligned with my sister's suicide back in 1980. Writers write what they know, and that's what I did. And so that's the beginning of the series. Fast Track is the name of that book. Lark becomes a journalist when she solves the mystery of the car train collision that orphaned her as an infant. She hooks up with Lionel Stone, who's the newspaper publisher. He's a former editor at the New York Times, Pulitzer Prize winner, and becomes her mentor. And his character parallels Lark going through all 6 novels. Bluff is the second novel. That too is set in southern Wisconsin. Lark, in that book, helps Lionel solve the mystery surrounding the death of his daughter along the Inca Trail in Machu Picchu in Peru, which I hiked as part of my research. Book 3, Troubled Water, takes place in Georgia, where I lived for a while. Lark joins a weekly newspaper as the cops and courts reporter and discovers a body of the work of a serial killer, and she has the inside track to solve the murder. The fifth novel, Bullet in the Chamber, actually fourth novel, Bullet in the Chamber, takes place in Washington. Lark is White House correspondent. Where did I get that idea? And she is and that book is personal as well because much of the subplot that's going on in Lark's life echoes and parallels the time when my youngest son went missing and was found dead a week later of an accidental heroin overdose. So again, I write what I know and I poured my pain into the book, which was very cathartic and therapeutic. Book 5, Fake. Lark is still a White House correspondent, and she's the victim of fake news. We, the reader, know that what's being told about her that becomes national news is not true. And I wanted to tell a story that shows that lies have consequences because I was very concerned at that point when Donald Trump was talking about reporters as enemies of the American people. Book 6, the most recent one, Lark is now White House press secretary. She's pregnant. The dad is dead. Abortion is a crime. She's ambivalent about becoming a single mom, and a dictator becomes president.
Well, talk about why you decided to write as a woman.
I thought you'd never ask. I get that question a lot. In fact, one woman at a book signing asked me, "What do you wear when you write?" Um, I wear just regular clothes, and I'm not, in any way other than a straight male. But the reason I wrote as a woman was not in any kind of calculated way. When I started writing fiction back in the mid 90s, someone suggested that I should write in a way that stretches who I am. Never been a woman, at least not in this life. So I gave it a try and discovered that emotions are not gender specific. Men and women have the exact same emotions. It's just that in my experience, the women in my life are more willing to share their emotions and they're more articulate about them. And so while I was at CNN, I was surrounded by young women in their early to mid 20s who would let me ask them questions about their jobs, their careers, their boyfriends, their parents, all those kinds of things. And I learned what it's like to be a woman because I asked and then I listened. And so many of these women became beta readers. They read early drafts of the manuscripts and gave me really helpful constructive criticism on what was working and, more importantly, what was not working. And so there's a deeper reason I discovered that I write as a woman, and that is it goes back to that, what I call the spooky power of the subconscious. And it wasn't until I went through grief counseling that I realized that the deeper reason that I write as a woman is to create a character in Lark Chadwick that I wish my sister had allowed herself to become. My sister, who killed herself in 1980, was she, she had tremendous potential. She could have been a concert pianist, she could have been a surgeon, but her husband said, what would it look like, a surgeon married to a football coach? And one by one, she gave up her dreams. And so Lark, still falls for the bad boys, but doesn't let a guy define who she is.
Well, as a manuscript editor, and you can also use this to talk about your writing coaching business, but as a manuscript editor, what is the biggest mistake you find that writers make?
Oh, let me count the ways. I think that, I mean, a lot of the mistakes writers make, I never see because they have decided to quit before they've even gotten started. For some reason, they have this tremendously strong urge to write. They may even have a story to tell, but they get discouraged. Either they start writing, white hot, and they get 50 pages in and they realize they haven't thought it through, they're overwhelmed, and they give up, or they compare their writing to someone who's really good and they feel that they don't have it in them to do it and they quit prematurely. And so that's really, I think, a huge mistake that would-be authors make. Once the manuscript gets to me, though, I do see a lot of the same kinds of mistakes. And probably the biggest one is that writers tend to tell their story instead of show it. To get your characters talking, have them interact with each other, because then the reader can see them interacting in their mind's eye. And another big mistake that I think rookie writers make is that they throw too much backstory into the book prematurely. What they need to do is to get the story started and then sprinkle in the backstory as the story goes on, as opposed to do a data dump of context that just confuses the reader because we don't really know what the story is.
Tell us about any current or upcoming projects that you're working on that listeners need to be aware of.
Three things. One, I haven't published it yet, but I've written a memoir that is now, I'm shopping it around to different publishers, and it basically highlights the pivotal moments in my life that brought me to where I am, and some of those we've talked about tonight. Um, there's also my seventh novel I'm working on. My wife and I worked on book six, Enemies Domestic, together. It's won 8 awards so far. And so we're using that approach again. I'll do the writing, she'll be my alpha reader and give me, guidance on where it can go from here. And then the third thing is that I'm widening the horizon and doing much more motivational speaking, not just to the writing community, but to corporations that have wellness programs, uh, um, veterans groups who are dealing with PTSD, hospitals that may have hospice services. So I'm helping people who are struggling with grief to use writing as a way to heal. And I'm not just talking about writing, not just grief that where you lost a loved one, but you can have lost a pet, a job, a relationship, your health, your innocence, any number of things. Grief is universal.
Well, so listeners can keep up with everything that you're up to, throw out your contact info.
You can contact me through my website, which is my name.com, johndedakis.com. That's John, D as in dog E, D as in dog A, KIS as in Sam, johndedakis.com.
All right, we'll close this out with some final thoughts. Maybe if that was something I forgot to talk about that you would like to touch on, or any final thoughts you have for the listeners.
Boy, I don't have any. I mean, you covered the ground. You're a very thorough interviewer. I guess the only thing I would leave people with is just take a breath. We live life with more time regretting the past and fearing the future and being ineffective in the moment. And I think if you take a breath and be more present in the moment, we'll be you'll be an agent, a potential agent for civility in our civil discourse so that you can help people, you can build bridges among people and between people instead of walls.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, JohnDedakis.com. Please check out John's books and everything that he's up to and his upcoming projects. Check out his website. Follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. And follow us on your favorite podcast platform. If you have any guest suggestions, you would like to be a guest yourself, any suggestions or feedback for the show, please visit www.curveball337.com. Thank you for listening and supporting the show. And John, thank you for all that you do, and thank you for joining me.
Curtis, thank you very much. This was a joy.
For more information on the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, visit www.curveball337.com. Until next time, keep living the dream.